All right, so I'm Steve Weagle. I'm the chief meteorologist at Channel 5, NBC, and Fox 29. And I'm a little tired and sore from a bike ride that I did all week. All right, the hardest day. Oh, thank you. If you haven't seen it, it's a Ride for the Red Cross. I've been doing it 21 years, and we raised $170,000, which is amazing. I think the first year we probably got 5 or 10,000, so it's really taken on a life of its own. And the toughest day was the day I came through here on Tuesday. It was just hot. It was 40 miles on Tuesday, so. And I'm not a bike rider. I bike 1 week a year. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about hurricane season. I'm not going to, I have a half an hour, so I like to take questions because there are some things I won't be able to cover and some things that you want to ask. So just wait till the end and we'll try to get in as many questions as we can too. All right, covered that. Okay, there is Hurricane Irma, and I think everyone everyone remembers Irma. I think a couple of things come to mind. Irma for me was probably one of the most amazing hurricanes to cover, not because it took a direct hit here, but just the number of people who evacuated even before there was a cone in this area, or I live in Jupiter where the Turnpike and 95 meet, and everyone was coming up from Miami and Lauderdale, and it was, I think, a week before, I think it was a Sunday night, and the Turnpike was blocked all the way to Orlando, and people were getting off at midnight, 1 in the morning, and they were getting on 95 to keep going north. That's before any watches or warnings or any real significant concern, and the gas was running out at gas stations. It was really an amazing situation that happened, and it I was going to say bordered on panic, but it was panic because people. This is a new weather satellite that just went up a couple of years ago from the Cape, GO-16, and it takes these incredible images, and people saw this on TV. This is around the Caribbean. In fact, you can see the Caribbean islands there, right through here. And people saw this, it looks like a buzzsaw, and it scared them. And one of the challenges now, and a lot of talk at the hurricane conferences that I go to, is not so much like improving the weather forecasts, but how we deal with the public in getting them ready and not panicking and not leaving if they don't have to leave and staying. I have a lot of friends who went to Tampa before this hurricane hit. If you remember back, it was supposed to go up, pretty much up I-95 as a category 4 or 5 hurricane. That was Wednesday. And then it shifted, stayed over Cuba a little longer, and then it shifted back toward Tampa, and it hit Tampa. And I have so many friends and so many viewers who went to Tampa. And I said for days, don't go to Tampa because it's still a few days out and it can shift. And so when they came back, I said, why did you go to Tampa? I told you not to. And they said, because my neighbors were going to Tampa, because I saw that, and it scared me. Which is, that's reasonable, but we're trying to get people to make smart decisions. We find that doing research on social behavior and weather that when it becomes a huge concern like this storm, just thinking normally goes out the window and people just act on instinct. So we're trying to get away from that, and obviously, and trying to get more people prepared. So that's Irma. Irma is also an amazing hurricane because it was a category 5 for so long. We rate hurricanes on a scale from category 1 to category 5. But we also do this, it's called ACE. It's the accumulated cyclone energy for the entire season. So it's all the hurricanes and tropical storms, and all their energy is added up for the entire season. This hurricane here, because it was a category 5 for so long, was pretty much the energy from an entire hurricane season. It was one of the most incredible hurricanes ever to form. And if you remember, we also had Maria just a few weeks later. There's a shot as it went over an island called Barbuda in the Caribbean. There are about 200 people who lived there and devastated the island, obviously. But that's the eye of the hurricane. So in a hurricane, the eye wall, if you will, the inner core is where you usually get the strongest winds, if it's a well-developed hurricane. Now in this hurricane, the winds around 170, 180 miles an hour. Those are the sustained winds. Those are not usually the winds that do the damage, it's the wind gusts, which are typically about 20% stronger. So you're talking wind gusts close to 200 miles an hour with this hurricane. And that's what tears at shingles and little pieces of your house that may be already compromised a little bit, and just continues to tear it over hours and hours. And that's what a lot of the damage that happens in hurricanes, where it comes from. These are the storm names for this year, and we already have one down. Andrea formed a few weeks ago. Is that in the north of the Bahamas? And there's a little system around the Yucatan, the Gulf of Mexico, that Hurricane Center today has bumped up to about a 50-50 chance of developing. Doesn't look like it'll have any impact on Florida. It's moving more toward southern Texas and northern Mexico. And that's no indication whether it's going to be a busy or a slow season. You know, the core part of the season is between mid-August and about mid-October. When I take vacation, I don't take it in that time period. I've been called back to work from another country 5 times because of hurricane threats. So I'm getting kind of tired of it. So I try to block out this time and not take any vacation time. Usually June and July and early August are typically slow. And then as we get into late October, you'll notice there's another weird little bump here. That's in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. Usually early in the season, we see storms form in the Gulf and the Caribbean. And then as we get into the real core part of the hurricane season after August 15th, a lot of storms form in the Atlantic. And then late in the season, it shifts back into the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean again. And that's what that second little bump is. Now, you'll see the peak day is September 10th, but that's for the entire Atlantic. More hurricanes have made landfall in Florida in the month of October than September. So, we mention on TV, oh, we're halfway through hurricane season. Well, we're not really through the halfway point. The whole Atlantic is. We're still under a pretty significant threat here until mid-October. So hurricanes are rated on a scale from Category 1 to Category 5. 1 is up to 95 miles an hour. And then Category 2, that would be Francis, that hit in 2004. And probably Wilma. You know, the problem with rating hurricanes, and Wilma was a real challenge, is that there are not very many weather sensors, and the anemometers are 3 little spinning cups that measure the wind. And the ones that are out there will break very easily. They're usually made out of plastic or PVC. And like in Hurricane Andrew, they all blew away at one point. The last one stood until about 154 miles an hour, and then so there are no readings. And so sometimes it's difficult, like in Hurricane Wilma, you see the damage, but it doesn't really correspond to what they're saying the strongest winds are, because we just don't have a good network of weather instruments. At Category 3, that would be Jeanne. And you know, this area, Jeanne was, here's another thing with hurricanes, you probably noticed this too. Francis came through, and there was, Bob Sheets, the old Hurricane Center director, used to call hurricanes urban renewal projects. They would come in and they would clean everything up that didn't belong there. And after Francis, there was junk everywhere. I mean, it was just, most streets you couldn't even drive through. And then 3 weeks later to the hour, Jeanne hit South Hutchinson Island as a Category 3. And I was really surprised that we had a chance to clean up a lot of the debris that was around. And Jeanne still obviously left a lot of debris, but it was more kind of significant. It was like power poles that had come down rather than, you know, big tree branches and some of the trees that were probably going to fall anyway. So, and obviously our building codes are getting better through the years too. Category 4 is up to 156, and then Category 5. Now, we set a record last year. We now have 4 Category 5 hurricanes that have hit the U.S. Michael is the latest. So I didn't even update this graphic. So now there's Michael, which hit the Panhandle last year. And we have 1935 hurricane. It's also called the Labor Day hurricane. If you drive down to Key West in Key Largo, there's a monument to several hundred railroad workers who were building Flagler's Railroad. and they died in that storm, and the train arrived right at the height of the storm. Let me just go ahead here. That's the train. It blew off the tracks. So they died in that storm. You can see this photo at Mallory Square in Key West too. There's a little write-up on it. And that's damage from Hurricane Andrew. So, you know, when they do, when you put hurricane shutters on your house, or even impact windows, or even if you put plywood if installed properly isn't too bad for, you know, a hurricane protection on your windows. It's got to be done properly though. It's not the sustained wind, it's the coconuts and the pieces of plywood going 150 miles an hour. That's why you're putting that stuff up, to protect your house, because that can easily go through a window. So when they rate hurricane shutters, they do a wind test, but they also do a projectile test where they shoot 2x4s out of cannons at the shutter or the piece of glass to make sure that it's, you know, rated for hurricane strength. So that's from Hurricane Andrew there. I don't know if I have another one here. Let me go back a frame here though. Here's, I do the weather, I do my own forecast day to day. I have a degree in meteorology, but when the hurricanes come, all the local stations use the Hurricane Center forecast, because we don't want you know, my colleagues at the other stations to say, oh, this one's coming, it's going to be bad, and then having me say, I don't think this one's going to hit. So we all keep consistent, and we're all very good in this TV market doing that. All my counterparts, some of them are out there today, we all keep it, some TV markets, there will be people who try to do their own, and it becomes chaos, because then you have evacuations that aren't necessary, and just a lot of confusion. But when the Hurricane Center gives a forecast, they give you two pieces of information. They tell you where the storm's going to be, and they do that with that cone, and they tell you how strong it's going to be. And in the last 20 years, they've done an amazing job at improving the track forecast. So if you go back to like 2005, Hurricane Wilma, you can see that's the red cone, and the cone continues to shrink because our computer models are getting much, much better. But the intensity forecast, not so much. In fact, I saw, and I didn't even realize this, I saw a talk a couple weeks ago, the Governor's Hurricane Conference was in West Palm, and they talked about Michael. Now Michael, if you remember last year, was a weak tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico. I even think the official forecast out 2 and 3 days was for a tropical storm to hit the Panhandle. It was a Category 5 hurricane. I mean, there's no comparison. But if you take a look at major hurricanes, especially the Category 5 hurricanes, what they were 3 and 4 days earlier, most were tropical storms. They were close to Florida or close to the US, and they just rapidly intensified. Like Wilma. Wilma was hardly anything and just exploded around Cancun, Jamaica, and the southern tip of Cuba into a Category 5 hurricane. Then it hit Cozumel and Cancun, and then made that right turn into Fort Myers and Naples and that area. So we do a great job with the tracks now, the intensity forecast not so much. So I always tell people, right or wrong, that if you have a hurricane that's coming and it's forecast to be a Category 3, or let's say Category 2 in Port St. Lucie, I would say in your head, you should be thinking, okay, the most likely scenario is a Category 3, but it could be a 2 or it could be a 4. Because we're just not there with the intensity forecasts. We're getting better, but not very fast. And there's a lot of research going into that. So hurricanes, most hurricanes form from tropical waves. What are tropical waves? They are clusters of thunderstorms that come off the coast of Africa. So this would be a tropical wave here, and this is kind of a weaker one right here. And kind of like the thunderstorms we see out west here in the afternoon in the summer. They're disorganized, but as they come off the coast, if they get a little bit of a spin, they become tropical depressions, and then tropical storms, and then eventually hurricanes. And they're about 60 to 80 a year, so 80 to 90% of them never develop into anything, but there are some that do, and that's what we watch for. And those storms in the middle part of the season can be critical because they have, early in the season we have the Gulf and the Caribbean, but some of the bigger storms have like couple thousand miles of ocean to tap into before they become a threat here. And some of the threats in a hurricane, obviously wind damage and storm surge and flooding, that would be rainfall. Francis and Jean, we had about 13 to 15 inches of rain. And if you, I know most of you are from Port St. Lucie, like Faye was a tropical storm, and that caused some serious issues in this area from, I believe, about 15 inches of rain. And it was just a mess of a storm, but 15 inches of rain over a day or two can have a huge impact, especially if the ground is already saturated. So we always tell people that it's not just the wind and the storm surge, it's also that flooding. And you know, if you look at storms like Harvey was like 5 feet of rain, it was 60 inches of rain. And a storm before that, I think I have a couple of photos. Allison was a tropical storm that hit Houston, and it also caused some serious issues. Now the watches and warnings, they come out 36 and 48 hours in advance, and those times, they used to be 24 and 36. So it just shows you how much of an improvement we've made over the years with the hurricane tracks, that they can. We always used to tell people if the storm is in the cone, if you're in the cone 5 days out, you should kind of watch it and, you know, keep a pretty good eye on it. And then when it's 3 days or 2 days or 1 day out, you know, it's going to have an impact in some sense. Now those tracks are so good, I would almost say at day 4 and day 5, if you're in the cone, you better be watching it, because it's going to have some sort of impact on your area. It might not be devastating, but if it doesn't hit near you, it'll likely hit pretty close to you. This is freshwater flood. So this is Allison, but I mean, even a better storm lately was Harvey that hit Houston. So that's I-10, I believe. Yeah, I-10. It's just underwater. Oh, like interstate's just completely underwater. And this was about 4 feet of rain, I think. It just sat over Houston for days and days. But I mean, I could show you Harvey, and Harvey's even worse. So flooding can obviously be very, very serious. And we've had some big flooding events here, like Faye was a big flooding event. Now, in 2004, everyone wanted to know where the Bermuda High was. Where's the high? Because it was forcing hurricanes into this area. Usually, hurricanes want to turn north. And in 2004, that Bermuda High was very strong, and it was right over Florida. It extended all, and so it won't turn north, it acts like a wall, so it forces the storms farther west, and then they become a threat to Florida or somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico. And this has been a weird, well, it's June 1st now, but last month, it was a very weird month, because early in the month, the high was very weak, and we got a lot of rainfall, and then for the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's been hot and humid and sunny, and the high is right over us. Like if there was a hurricane out there right now, I would be concerned, even if it was in the central Atlantic, because the high has been so persistent for weeks, and the hurricane's not going to turn north. If it's not going to hit Florida, it's going to come very close to Florida. Luckily, there's not a hurricane out there right now, and it's very difficult to tell where that high will be in August and September and October when it really matters. Like right now, it'll fluctuate back and forth, but it's in a position right now where it's a little bit of a concern. But this isn't a busy part of the season, so you know there is no concern. Okay, so the forecast. Now there are 2 types of forecasts. So the 5-day forecast from the Hurricane Center, and then NOAA and Colorado State and about 10 other agencies, universities, and research groups do seasonal hurricane forecasts. So they take a look at water temperatures, and they take a look at whether there's an El Nino, what the upper level winds are doing, if there's a persistent high. They kind of look, whenever there's a strong El Nino, there are usually very few hurricanes and tropical storms in the Atlantic. So there's a pretty solid correlation there. And this year there's a weak El Nino, so it'll have somewhat of an impact. It doesn't look like it's going to change much. And then there's a little bit cooler than normal water temperatures in some areas too. So this is the Colorado State forecast. This may have been adjusted in the last day or two. I've been on a bicycle, so. And NOAA also puts out a forecast. They put out a range. They put out like, I think this year they put out like 11 to 15 named storms, something like that. And a lot of people, I don't like showing this graphic because a lot of people make their preparations. So this will turn out to likely be an average year, but it only takes one storm to hit. 1992 was a very slow season. Think about 1992. 1992, the A storm, so the first storm of the season, didn't form until late August. And it formed way off in the Atlantic, and the problem was it was Andrew. And it went due west for days and days. Now, I wasn't here at the time. I was in school taking meteorology, but we watched it. Maybe I was with the Weather Service. Anyway, that storm initially looked like it was going to go into Jacksonville, and then it was Daytona, and then it was around this area, and then Lauderdale, and then eventually it hit south of Miami. So even though, if this season, we've already had our A storm, but if there was nothing for the next 2 months, you'd be like, oh, this is great. There's not going to be anything this year. But it only takes one storm. And the perfect example is 1992 with Andrew. So it's always important to be prepared. I know a lot of people who make preparations based on this. Like sometimes we have trouble getting the next 5 days right. And they're trying to make a forecast for the next 4 months. It's just, it's important research. It's just people shouldn't be making plans with this stuff. I mean, I know like energy companies will do it for the Gulf of Mexico and oil rigs and, farmers, but it's just kind of beginning science. And I think a lot of people, though, were fooled with Hurricane Wilma. Like I got a lot of grief after Hurricane Wilma. It was stronger than you said. But I disagree. I mean, it was a little stronger, but here's the problem with Wilma. I think Wilma caught a lot of people off guard because they saw a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. It was a Category 3, but it was in the Gulf of Mexico. It had to cross the entire state before it became any kind of threat here. And a lot of people ignored Wilma. The problem with Wilma is that it was going 25 miles an hour in its forward speed. So from Fort Myers to here, it only took 4 hours. It was just racing across. So it had very little time to lose strength. And even when it made it to the East Coast, it was still a significant storm. In fact, it caught the emergency managers off guard too. I mean, most of the preparedness stuff was sent to Fort Myers and sent to the West Coast. And most of the damage ended up being here from Wilma. But here's another weird stat. Gene hit, and it was a major hurricane, Category 3. Well, if you look back at those hurricane forecasts for 2004, Colorado State said there was pretty much a zero chance of getting a major hurricane on the Treasure Coast that year. Well, that did not happen because Gene was here. So anyway, I'll shut up now.
Oh, thank you.